Hello, and welcome to Listen.Up.People, a podcast of the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work. I'm Dr. Holly Priebe-Sotelo, Associate Teaching Professor of Practicum Education and your host for the second season of the podcast. Before I get started, I just really want to give a quick shout out to my predecessor, Dr. Eric Rice. He did such a wonderful job hosting our first season, and we're grateful for him for giving us such a solid start. I was a guest on his episode, on one of the episodes on the topic of human trafficking, and I enjoyed it so much. And now I'm honored to be launching the first episode of the second season. So I want to say thank you, Eric. All the best to you for your new venture, and I will try to proudly carry this torch you have passed to me. So today we're going to explore the increasingly important role that school social workers play in fostering students' social and emotional well-being for productive learning in the classroom. School social workers provide a valuable support to students struggling with truancy or academic performances due to a variety of factors that may include issues in their home life or exposure to traumatic events. And my background is also as a school social worker in K-12 public schools for 18 years. So this is a subject that's very near and dear to my heart. My guests today have experienced many different sides of school social work in different educational settings, in training and education of school social workers and on the ground in classrooms. Dr. Kerry Doyle, Associate Teaching Professor and my colleague at the USC Suzanne Dworak-Peck School of Social Work, is an expert in the area of educational needs of school social workers, including trauma-informed training. And Dr. Maria Ruelas, a USC MSW alumna who serves as a district social worker for the Lawndale Elementary School District in Los Angeles and was named the 2025 School Social Worker of the Year by the Los Angeles County Office of Education. Congratulations to you, Maria. We are so proud of you. Okay, so it is great to see you both. It is my honor I feel like I'm in a room with friends. So this is going to be a great conversation. So something Dr. Eric Rice started off with his discussions was to ask a more personal question, which I would really like to continue with you both. It really helps us to understand like what your interests were. How did you come into this work? And so I'd like to start with you, Kerry, with how did you become involved in school social work or social work in the educational settings?
Great. Thanks, Holly. So I actually had a really circuitous route to social work in general. So my undergraduate degree was in political science with the intent to go to law school. But in my final year, I decided that being a lawyer really wasn't a right fit for me. So for a few years, I worked in the insurance industry, and weirdly enough, that actually was helpful because I learned the ins and outs of Medicaid and Medicare. So it actually helped me in the long run be a better social worker. But for the first few years, I was really lost. I didn't know what social work was. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And during that time, I would visit my sister, who was a school social worker. And this was back in the late 1990s. So I could visit her at school. And so I would go multiple days a week to have lunch with her. And I was able to see firsthand the amazing work that she was doing. And I fell in love with school social work. And my first internship, my first year in my MSW program was at the New York City schools. And I realized right then and there I wanted to be a school social worker. But I returned back to my home state, and I live in a small New England state. And at that time, there was limited school social work positions, and there wasn't a lot of turnover. So I actually did not have my first school-based job until 12 years post MSW. However, during that 12 years, I worked extensively with children, adolescents, families in school adjacent settings. So I became familiar with many of the school districts. I really honed my mental health skills and interventions. So when my time came, I felt really not only excited, but prepared to be a high school social worker. So it was a circuitous route, but I got there.
I love that. I did not know that about you, Kerry. Thank you so much for sharing. And Maria, I mentioned your recent Social Worker of the Year award, but this is actually your second time receiving this honor. You first received it in 2018 from the California Association of Social Workers. When did you discover that school social work was for you?
it was truly solidified that I wanted to go into schools when I entered my first year of internship at the USC School of Social Work. And I really got a front row seat to what it was to work in systems. The systems perspective of social work really encompassed what I was looking for in terms of mental health, being preventative, working with community, and the family support. And I never thought school social workers could be in schools until I had my internship experience. And that's when I realized there is a space for us. There is important value in the work that we do because we do bring in that systems building perspective. And so we look at issues not only within the four walls of a school, but outside the community, the school, the relationships that are within the school. So it's far more than individual counseling and facilitating groups. There is a space for us to also be in leadership roles and focus on things like program development and ensuring we have workforce pipelines and strengthening mental health supports across the entire district, not just one school. And so that's when I realized this was a space for me.
Right on. Oh my God, Maria, I'm so proud of you because you're a legend in the schools, just everywhere. And so I'm just so proud. And you really did some groundbreaking work there doing macro, bringing in other social workers, which we will talk about more in just a moment. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm going to go back to Kerry. So Kerry, I'd really like to start this question out for you. I want our listeners to know that our school is one of few schools in the United States that we offer a specialized curriculum and certification opportunities in school and educational settings. Can you give our listeners a general overview of what it means to specialize as a school social worker and what the curriculum and certification is that our school offers?
Absolutely, Holly. So when we're talking about specializing as a school social worker, what we're really talking about, in my opinion, is about working at the intersection of mental health, education, families, and as Maria mentioned, systems. So school social workers are trained to not only support students at the individual level, but also through a broader systems lens. The school social work role is incredibly dynamic. It includes mental health intervention, but it also includes crisis response, attendance and engagement, special education services, collaborating with teachers and administrators in order to address systemic barriers that might impact student learning. So it's a very dynamic role that requires multiple skills. So it's essential that school social workers go into the setting understanding that. In terms of preparation for this role at USC, our curriculum offers a school and education settings track, which offers specialized coursework, as well as a school-based practicum where students have the opportunity to integrate what they're learning in the classroom setting into actually a school-based internship, a real school environment. We also offer what's known as the PPSC credential. And so that's the Pupil Personnel Services credential. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, that is what the state of California requires for a social worker to work in public education settings. And the wonderful thing is in our curriculum, USC embeds the PPSC requirements directly into the MSW program when students select that track and the PPSC option. So students can potentially graduate with not only their MSW, but their PPSC credential. But also we go a step further. So for graduates who are already working in skills that also want to continue to develop, we also offer a postgraduate certification in trauma-informed practices in educational settings, which is a wonderful continuing education opportunity for those of you who are already working in schools. But I think, Holly, what I really appreciate about our approach at USC is we're preparing school social workers not only to engage on an individual level, but in complex systems through our specialization, but also through our curriculum. So we offer integrative social work, and integrative social work covers all three levels of social work. So we're not micro social workers or macro social workers that are siloed. We are social workers. And being a school social worker demands that we operate on all levels of practice, micro, meso, and macro.
I am so glad that you mentioned integrative social work, and thank you so much, because this is for those who are entering or wanting to learn more about it, is that you're given an experience across a wide spectrum to working in the school setting. So love that you integrated that, and that USC. I'm so proud that we're offering that for our society here. And Maria, do you want to add anything to
No,
that?
I completely agree. Firsthand, I'm an alumni from the school, and I can attest to that. Those are the experiences that brought me into school social work. I did not know I was going to go into school social work, and because of the experiences and the integrative systems level thinking, that is what got me here. And now that I'm here, I'm a leader in the field, and I'm really happy to learn that that's something that the school is actively working on, is developing that for their students.
Yes, yes, Maria. And as a follow-up, I'd really like to hear some of the main issues that that students and teachers that are impacting schools in your area. And is there a shortage of school social workers?
Every day that I walk into a school, I am reminded of the importance of school social workers. And because our school district has been very progressive and very supportive of school social workers, I'd like to say that in our school district, we don't have a shortage of them. However, in going to conferences and speaking to other colleagues, speaking to other leaders in education, it is almost mind blowing to know that there's school social workers, that there's one at each school site here in Lawndale, versus in other school districts. When I was hired, there was one social worker, which was me, for an entire school district. And I remember how difficult that was for me at the start. And so it is very difficult. There is a shortage. The ratio to students is not what we want to see. And so I do see that there's gaps in our schools. And I believe that building that strong partnership and different pipelines to get school social workers into schools is important. For instance, having interns, graduate level interns that are entering the workforce, and training them so that they're able to experience what school social work is like. And then maybe at their school districts, they're able to be of service to their school communities. But yes, there is a shortage with school-based mental health professionals. And I think it's an area that we definitely need to uncover and talk about more, because leaders in educational settings need to know what school social workers are able to offer. And that is more than just one-on-one counseling or therapy.
Right. And Maria, maybe if we can expand on that just a little bit more for our listeners they don't really know what is a social worker? Why are they in schools? Isn't it about reading and learning, and why a social worker? And that's a question I want all our listeners to know. If you could just kind of give an example, like a day-to-day, what a social worker might be doing in a school.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think that here in Lawndale, it looks very different in that when our first Latina superintendent started here, she's from Baldwin Park. She came to Lawndale, and she's like, Maria, what do the social workers do? What do you do? My response was, well, the social workers here in Lawndale are like pseudo administrators, in that, yes, they do provide one-on-one therapy to students whenever it's needed, but that's not their primary role. They don't have a caseload per se. Our interns, because we have built capacity and partnerships with universities, our interns are the ones that obtain that training and that address the mental health needs of our students with the supervision of our school social workers. In addition to that, our mental health providers are also taking in a lot of referrals and meeting with students. The social workers are facilitating groups, they're facilitating parent workshops to engage the school community, in addition to crisis management, in addition to implementation of positive behavioral interventions and supports. That's short, or in short, PBIS. PBIS is a framework that is used in the state of California to create community environment in schools. And so that's implemented with the help of our social work team. Attendance, that's another issue in public education, especially post-pandemic, in that a lot of students have developed mental health issues, and social workers, instead of just meeting with a student at school, they go outside of the school, they go to the parents' homes, they do home visits, and they ask, what's going on, how can we help? And because they have that mental health background, they're able to assess, is it anxiety, is it depression, is it housing instability? Because once you get to the home, you realize, wow, I didn't know this child lived in a motorhome. I didn't know this child, lived across the street in their car. So that's the way our social workers in Lawndale are able to address the different systems. So not only individually, but in group settings, working with parents, working with teachers and the school administrators to implement these initiatives at the school site.
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. And one of the things I remember as social workers in the schools is that trying to explain it to people who are not social workers of what we do is that kind of thinking about the concept that you can't teach an empty chair. So if a child isn't able to come to school, if a child isn't able to eat, if they haven't slept, if they are experiencing abuse, they're not going to focus and they're not going to learn. And so these are the things that as a school social worker, I just know that children won't learn when their basic needs have not been met. And so it is so crucial that we continue to support social work in schools because there's so many gaps that are impacting our students, and not just here in Los Angeles County, but around the nation. This next question I'm going to ask Kerry first is that I want to recognize that we live in an era where gun violence in schools has become a reality that too many schools have had to face. And so, Kerry, I know that you've done a lot of work in this area, including your doctorate dissertation that focused on the experiences of school social workers providing crisis response and recovery following a targeted gun violence. Can you please talk to us about the findings of your study and why school social workers are so important to the response and recovery process?
My focus was really on preparation. How are we preparing school social workers to interact and provide support within a setting that is increasingly becoming more violent? So in addition, my research focused on mass gun violence, but there's violence that occurs in schools on smaller scales than mass gun violence. And so my question was, how are we preparing our school social workers for crisis response and recovery? My doctoral research focused on the experiences of school social workers who provided actual response and recovery after their school experience with gun violence. And it was a qualitative study. And it really focused on, did they feel prepared? What skills did they rely on? And how did it impact them personally and professionally? And again, I just want to stress, school social workers handle crises on a daily basis outside of gun violence. So student and staff deaths, serious accidents, community violence, natural disasters. So school social workers are handling crises on a regular basis. So do they feel prepared to respond? And one of the most significant findings in my research was around that. And the majority of participants only described themselves as feeling moderately prepared to respond to a crisis. And what really stood out for me was that several participants struggled to name the specific intervention or the theoretical underpinnings for why they were using that intervention. Instead, they attributed their response to instinct or intuition rather than their formal training. And from a social work education perspective, that's really concerning. Our work is not just instinctive. We are highly trained professionals. And being able to name the interventions and understand why we're using them is essential for ethical practice and our professional legitimacy, right? Because as professionals, we're interfacing with administrators, law enforcement during a crisis. In addition to how prepared they felt, many of the participants emphasized that with trauma, the recovery is not a straight line. There's always trauma reminders such as time markers, legal proceedings, media coverage, or other crises that reactivate the trauma. So this is a long-term process. It's the response is initial, but then there's recovery. And then another finding is around self-care, the impact personally and professionally. And I went in thinking, okay, what supports did these professionals get to why they were providing support to others? And I was surprised to learn that the biggest support was being able to connect with their colleagues who they felt like had a shared experience, that connection, that relationship. And I think that as school social workers, it's so important that we remember the power of relationships. So as professionals, we're skilled in engagement, assessment, intervention. But I think it goes back to what the author, Dr. Judith Herdman, said, that recovery can only take place within the context of relationships and not occur in isolation. And I think as social workers, we understand the importance of connection, relationship, and also intervention on multiple system levels. So I think that social workers are uniquely trained for crisis response and recovery. And I would echo something Maria said, is that we need a seat at the table. We need to be at the decision makers table because we come from a systems perspective, we come from a strengths-based perspective, and we come from a trauma responsive perspective. And I would encourage us as school social workers to be advocates in that area and try to get a seat at the table.
I agree 100%. Love that. Maria, would you like to add anything?
Yes, I completely 100% agree that when I entered the field of social work in school settings, I was prepared. The university had prepared me, my professors had prepared me, and that, yes, at the root of it all, it comes down to relationships with teachers, relationships with administrators, with parents, with students. You can't get to the student unless you get to the parent. We really think systemically, and I completely agree with what Kerry said.
There's so much that we can do with just the connections, and so integrating that as part of the recovery process is vital. So excellent. Glad to hear that. And I want to shift gears just a moment and really ask about because we're still in this recovery phase from the COVID-19 pandemic, where it's 6 years ago. It feels like it was just yesterday. But Maria, I'd really like to, just kind of thinking about there's that lingering debate around whether or not schools are still feeling impacts from COVID. Can you share with us how your students and your district, how your students might be still impacted, if they are, how the schools are recovering?
The pandemic accelerated a lot of important conversations that social workers were discussing around mental health, around wellness, around the whole child support. It became a topic of conversation that was extremely important at the time because students were experiencing anxiety, grief, uncertainty, isolation. And so the pandemic really changed the fabric of our education system. Schools became a safe place for students to get their meals, to get their mental health support, their stability, and then that was taken away. And then 6 years later, we see the ripple effects that it's having on students, on parents, the challenges with attention span, their emotional regulation. Those are some of the things that have come up for us after the pandemic, after seeing that the students really were affected by this experience. And so now we've had a lot of conversations about how can we help our students as a whole? How can we collaborate with different people within the school setting so that we could get outcomes? And I think that's the most difficult part that administrators have right now is there are multiple people with various levels of expertise, and getting them together to work collaboratively to support the students is something that we are working on.
there's been a lot of discussions about like young people now, and some of my contacts still with teachers that I work with and principals, and they still see this shift of learners that are struggling with social emotional, attachments and still having struggles, and they attribute it back to the pandemic. It's like, well, these young people, they grew up during the time when the pandemic, when they were so isolated. So there's still, I have heard from my fellow colleagues and friends that are in the schools that, there is some residual impacts. Kerry, I don't know if you wanted to add to that at all, and before we start to close up.
Absolutely. It goes back to the whole idea that trauma is not linear and recovery takes time. So with trauma, there's impacts in the immediate, and then there's ongoing impacts. That we're seeing the continued impact of COVID does not surprise me. But I am encouraged that as a profession, we're recognizing it and we're developing interventions and support for these students who were impacted.
Yes, thank you so much. And so, as we come to the end of our discussion today, I'd really like to ask, I'll start with Kerry first and then Maria. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about, that I didn't ask about, that you would like our listeners to know about school social work?
My bias is trauma training in schools, and I would encourage any individual that is interested in school social work to make sure that you feel that you're prepared. That might mean taking trainings like psychological first aid or CBITS, cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools, or it might be taking a course in neurobiology of trauma and how trauma can impact our brains, both in the way students regulate their behaviors and their emotions. And I think this is critically important because so often students can be reprimanded for disruptive behaviors in class, and sometimes teachers or administrators or staff assume that is either due to oppositionality or due to attentional difficulties. Oftentimes they'll say, oh, this student has ADHD, and what is often overlooked is the underlying trauma that might be impacting regulation, emotional and behavioral regulation. And so my bias is, as school social workers, we need to know the neurobiology of trauma and those interventions so we're supporting students, but not only supporting students, but working with our educators and our administrators to develop a trauma responsive. The term trauma informed is used quite frequently. I steer away from that term now. One of our colleagues, Professor Lisa Wolby-Viet, who was a former school social worker, and she's the crisis recovery consultant for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the most impacted families. And she has really influenced me to move away from trauma informed to trauma responsive. It's not enough informed. We have to, at least as a profession, do our best to influence the school systems we work within to become trauma responsive. And just a quick shout out to Dr. Steve Hayden, the director of schools track, as well as project specialist Jenny Kim, who do an amazing job coordinating the track and the credential.
Excellent. I love that. Thank you, Kerry. Maria, any final thoughts for our listeners?
Well, I agree that we have to be trauma responsive, and that's what school social work is all about. School social workers, they could be working with a teacher, collaborating with the administrator, facilitating a parent workshop, responding to a crisis, and every single day it looks different. That's what makes it so powerful, because we're able to advocate for students, we're able to build systems, problem solve, all at the same time. And so at its core, this work is really about hope and possibility. And if we invest in school social work, we're investing in students' futures, teacher support, and the overall school community. It's more than a job, it's a calling, and it's one of the most meaningful ways I know to create lasting change.
Excellent. Excellent. I love that. And so thank you, Kerry and Maria, for joining us for a great discussion today. To our listeners, if you want to learn more about social work in schools and the educational setting, please visit our dworak-peck.usc.edu/school social work. And if you are interested in our graduate certificate in the trauma-informed practices in educational settings, visit dworak-peck.usc.edu/graduate certificates. Or if you would like to network with our amazing guests regarding their work or want to support our transformative research and programs, please email us at listenuppeople@usc.edu.